Hey everyone, welcome back to the homestead. I am Nadine. Today we're going to be talking about starting seeds for your garden and how it can benefit you on your homestead. So the biggest reason that we start seeds inside is to extend your growing season. A growing season is the amount of time between your last frost date and your first frost date of a season. So your last frost date will be your last frost in spring. Your first frost date will be your first frost of fall. Sorry, that's a lot of F's. And that is your growing season. Now, depending on where you're at, your season is going to be shorter or longer than mine. I am in Grow Zone 6 up here in Pennsylvania, and our growing season is about 150 days. Now, if you're farther north than us, your growing season is probably going to be a little bit shorter. If you're south of us, your growing season is probably going to be a lot longer. So for us, starting our seeds indoors really adds about 2 months to our growing season, which is awesome. Most seeds need 6 to 8 weeks to sprout or to germinate. Now, you don't have to start your seeds inside. You can direct sow most of them directly outside once you're free of your frosts. But that takes a big chunk away from your main growing season. And when you have a small growing season like us, that's kind of like a handicap. So we really want to start those seeds indoors, give ourselves an extra month and a half to 2 months of growing time in our season. So for us, starting our seeds inside really allows us to take advantage of the colder, kind of unusable months here on our homestead. We start our seeds about middle March, end of March, early April, depending on when our last frost date is. Sometimes it's in April, sometimes it's in May. It just depends. But that really allows us to use those first couple months of spring where it's just too cold to do anything, and lets us take advantage of those inside to get a jump start on our garden for the year. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can start seeds inside. This is how I do it because it's what I had on hand and it was available to me. So I'm going to walk you through how I start seeds here on our homestead. Now, as you can see behind me here, I have two greenhouses. These are actually outdoor greenhouses, but they never worked for me outside. They would always blow over and the covering would always end up torn, and it was a mess. It didn't work. So I decided to repurpose them as seed growing racks. And it's worked out really, really well for me. I'll link up here somewhere a link to how I set these up in case you guys want to do that as well. Like I said, it's worked out really well for me in the past. So I'm going to just keep doing what I'm doing and go from there. So in my experience using grow lights, these are LED grow lights and give me better lighting for my seedlings. My house really gets no natural lighting, so I can't just set up a shelf in front of a window and cross my fingers. It just doesn't work for me. I had to give my seedlings extra light. So that is where these LED grow lights come in handy. I will link them down below for you guys so you can find them as well. I have 2 lights per shelf, and this really gives my seeds the light that they need to grow properly. Now, like I said, in my experience using these grow lights, it knocks about 2 weeks off of their growing. So last year, when I used grow lights for the very first time, I started my seeds according to what the packaging said on the back, which is like 6 to 8 weeks. And they grew so fast and so big that they were ready to be planted before the weather was ready for me to plant them. So this year I knocked about 2 weeks off of that recommended start date to hopefully mitigate that problem of my plants getting too big too fast and the weather not being ready for me. So that is what I did this year, and so far it's working out really well for me. Our last frost date this year is April 23rd. Roughly speaking, usually it's around Mother's Day, which is like the second week of May. So it's a little bit earlier this season than it has been in the past. So I'm excited to get my hands in the dirt a little bit earlier this year. That's exciting. So I held off a little bit before I started my seeds. Now, another thing that I did a little bit differently this year than I did last year was I actually planned my garden. Last year I just kind of wung it, and I grabbed a bunch of seeds and I just kind of threw them in seed starting trays, and I just kind of hoped for the best. And I had too much of some plants and not enough of other plants. And so, although my garden worked out really well, I wanted to make better use of my space by planning a little bit better this year. So I'll show you how I went about planning my garden in a little bit here, but I wanted to show you what I use to start my seeds in. I want to talk a little bit about the soil that I use, and kind of give you guys a little bit more information. So these are the trays that I use for starting my seeds. As you can tell, it's a little bit of everything. So here's some empty ones that I can kind of work with. These bottom trays are called 10 by 20 trays. They do not have holes in them, and I'll tell you why in a minute. I will link all of these trays and things in the description below so that you guys can find them easily for yourselves. So, but anyway, these are called 10 by 20 trays, these really big ones here. And these don't have holes in them because I like to use a method called bottom watering, and I'll show you that in a minute here. But so these are the trays that I use. And then I get these 6-pocket seed starting trays, I guess you could call them. I'm not 100% sure what they're called, but so I get these ones that are 6 pockets. I also have these little pots that work really well. They're a little bit heavier duty of a plastic, so I like that because they're a bit more sturdy, which means they'll last a little bit longer for me. And they're a little bit bigger, so the root system will do a little bit better before I have to transplant them. So I use those. And then I've also gotten these ones from Walmart, but I do believe you can find them on Amazon as well. But these are just more seed starting trays, and these ones came with these plastic like greenhouse lids, which are really, really nice. So that's another tray system that I use. Now, when I ordered these on Amazon, they didn't come with this greenhouse lid, which is really, really convenient. Because it helps trap the heat and the moisture in, which seeds need to germinate. However, if you don't have this, some saran wrap will work in a pinch. I used 2 strips and made it wide enough to cover the whole tray on every direction, and just laid it gently over top, and it'll work the same way as this plastic like greenhouse cover will. So the greenhouse cover and the saran wrap are really only used to help your seedlings or your seeds sprout. Seeds need a certain level of heat. I've just found that the heat of my house plus the lights and the saran wrap is enough to make them germinate. You can use heat mats. I've never done that before, but a lot of people recommend it. But for me, the saran wrap and the greenhouse lids have worked just fine. Now, once you start seeing green, you're going to want to remove those saran wrap or the lids. That way you don't overheat your plant and either burn them or just make them wilt because they're too hot. So I find that once I see green in like 90% of the pots, I take those off, and they do really, really good. As much as I love these little, seed starting trays and pots and things, there's going to come a time when your seedling just needs more space. So you're going to need to transplant them. Maybe. It just depends on how quickly they sprouted and how close you are to your last frost of the season. For me, I've had to transplant everything just because I'm starting my seeds so soon inside to get to that last frost that I want my plants as big as I can to plant them. So you can either buy larger pots, but honestly, I've found that I just get some like solo cups, poke some holes in the bottom. I get these from the Dollar Tree, Dollar General for what, $1 for, I don't know, 20 or so or more. And just transplant them into the solo cups, and they have done excellent in them. They may not last as long as some larger pots that you might buy on Amazon, but cost effective wise and size wise, they work really, really great. That's what I ended up doing last year, and I had no problems with my transplants. So that's a way that you can give your seedlings a little bit more space if they get too big for these little starting pots, and that'll give you a little bit more time before you plant them. So earlier I mentioned I like to do a bottom watering method. Now what this means is, let me turn this around and show you guys. I'm going to take this off of here. Now bottom watering means you fill this bottom tray with water and allow the pot or the seed starting tray to suck up the water using the holes and openings on the bottom of the pot or like seed starting tray. See how they have holes in the bottom? What I really love about this method is you can't overwater your plants this way. The soil will only suck up as much water as it can hold, and you won't wash out your seeds. So I know some seeds are like super, super, super tiny, and if you top water them with, a cup or a spray bottle or a watering can, you can actually wash those seeds out and drown them, and we don't want that. So I really, really, really like the bottom watering method because I haven't overwatered any of my plants, and they've always had just what they need to sprout and grow really nicely for me. So that is a method I highly recommend for watering your plants and your seeds to get them going. And then once your plants are bigger, some plants don't like their leaves getting wet. It can cause mold, mildew, and other things that we just don't want in our plants. So bottom watering is another great way to just protect your seedlings as they're growing because they don't like their top parts being wet. So that's another reason why I really, really like bottom watering. Now I want to talk about the soil that you use. So you can use a seed starting mix, which is really, really light. It's very airy. It's easy for the seeds to push through. The only problem with seed starting mix is there's really not a lot of nutrition in that mix. So your seeds are going to be, they're going to sprout, but then they're not going to have the nutrition they need to keep growing. So if you use a seed starting mix, you're going to want to transplant them very quickly or very soon after sprouting into a potting mix that has the nutrients that they need. Now, I like to skip that step and save myself some work, and I just use potting soil to begin with. Now, I like to use, when you're looking for a potting soil, you want something that's very loomy, very light, very easy for your seeds to grow through, but it has the nutrients that it needs to grow. I like to use this Happy Frog potting soil. It has worked really, really well for me. I like the ingredients in it. And my seeds have just done really, really well in this soil. Let me show you the ingredients on it. So here are the ingredients in the Happy Frog Fox Farm potting soil. It's got 50 to 60% aged forest products, sphagnum peat moss, perlite, and fertilizer, which has your nitrogen, phosphate, potash, calcium, and those are derived from earthworm castings, bat guano, oyster shell, and dolomite lime. And then it also contains all of those things, which I don't know what those are, but their soil also has soil microbes in it, which is basically like helpful bacteria in your soil, which helps your plants do really well. But overall, I really just I like the company, I like their products, and I've had really good success with them in the past. So it's a soil that I reach for all the time, and I can find it locally. I've also ordered it on Amazon before, but I highly recommend looking for it locally if you can. But yeah, when you use a potting soil, it has more of the nutrients that your seedlings need to keep growing. And you won't need to transplant as often, and you won't need to fertilize as often either. So that is why I use a potting soil over a seed starting mix to start my seeds. Another thing that you're going to want to do when you start your seeds is make sure that you label everything, because as you can see here, if I didn't have labels, all of these guys pretty much, oh, there's none in there, look the same when they're starting. And when it comes time to plant all these guys outside, you're going to want to know what you're planting and where. That way you can trellis it if need be, give it as much space as it needs, and just be able to plan out your garden a little bit better. So label your seeds after you plant them. It's very helpful. So I mentioned earlier that this year I planned my garden. And by planning my garden, it really helped me kind of narrow down how many seeds I was starting. Last year I would start an entire flat of like one variety of tomato, and I just had way too many than I needed. And so this year I really tried to plan out my garden as best I could. Now what I did was I just got a notebook of graph paper. This is graph paper. And I drew out my garden, basically. So my garden is all rectangular and square boxes. And so I just made each box 1 square foot and drew out my boxes to their scale size. So all of my walkways are 4 feet wide between all of the boxes. And then each box is 4 foot by 8 foot. And so that's what I drew out. I drew where my trellises are. And this kind of gives me like a map and a layout of my garden space. And then once I had this space all mapped out, I went through and I marked where I wanted like my large crops. So I've got my tomatoes, my peppers, my vining plants, where I wanted to put my marigolds and my cosmos and zinnias, and where I want to do like my onions. And so I really just kind of mapped everything out, and this really gave me a good idea on how many of each plant I would need to get started. Once I had a better idea of how many of each plant I wanted to plant in my garden, I was able to then figure out how many seeds I needed to start. So I would take, say I needed 8 tomato plants of a certain variety. So let's just use, Italian heirloom tomatoes as an example. So for my garden plan, I need 8 Italian heirloom tomatoes. And so I started, I think, 2 or 3 extra seeds to ensure that I had enough to transplant later. And this just kind of gives me a little bit of security, whether my seeds didn't germinate or maybe a seedling just died off. And that would give me enough to, basically give myself a little bit of wiggle room as far as what I started seed-wise in comparison to what I actually need to plant. So I always recommend planting a little bit more than what you need, but not an outrageous amount where you just don't have the space to plant it, or it's just more than you can use. So yeah, that's how I went about planning my garden beds this year. So planning my garden this year not only helped me kind of narrow down how much I started and how much I'm going to be planting, but it helped me to really maximize my garden space, because last year, like I said, I just kind of wung it and I just planted a whole bunch of whatever I had. And although like my garden was really, really successful, it was also like there's a lot of things that I wanted to plant that I just didn't have room for because I started too much of the same thing. And so this year, with me planning things, I really gave myself an opportunity to maximize the amount of space that I had to grow food for my family. So I really narrowed down the varieties of the plants that I grew last year to the ones that I loved the most. And so this year I'm only growing, 3 varieties of tomatoes, 2 varieties of peppers, and a whole bunch of other stuff that I wasn't able to grow last year. So I'm really excited to have more space to work with, which means more food production for my family, and just helps me be smarter with my space. So I highly recommend planning out your garden if you can. Like I said, I do it really simple. I just use, some grid paper and map out my garden and just start with like the big stuff, the stuff that's going to be in the ground all season long. So there's a lot of crops out there that are like rotational crops. So you plant them, you harvest them, you want to plant them again. So like lettuce, radishes, carrots, cabbage, basically stuff that you're going to be harvesting and needing to replant. So I really mapped out the stuff that's going to be permanent for that growing season. So because I mapped out like the permanent fixtures of my garden for the growing season, the stuff that's going to be, deep rooted and going to be producing all growing season long, it gave me more space to work with the stuff that needs like rotationally planted, which again allows me more production for my family and makes more use of the space that I have. So I highly recommend, if you're going to map out your garden, map out the stuff that's going to stick around all season long. So your tomatoes, your peppers, your vining vegetables or fruits, your flowers, things like that. Map those out. And then you'll have a map also of where you can plant your rotational crops also. Seed starting is a ton of fun. So don't stress yourself out. Take a deep breath and just have fun with it. This is such a joy on my homestead that I know you guys are just gonna love as well. So a quick tip here, because I know if you're new to this can be very overwhelming. And so I want to help this be a fun and enjoyable experience for you. when you're starting your seeds in your garden. So I highly recommend looking for some Facebook groups about gardening in your area. So go on Facebook, go to your groups and search for, gardening groups in my city, and join a couple of those groups, and then ask people, what are some good seeds to start for my area? What grows well, what doesn't? And even ask them like, hey, what are some of your favorite varieties? I know for me, looking at seed catalogs and going to the store and seeing the shelves of seeds, it can be really overwhelming as far as like, what am I even gonna like? And so when I started, I just kind of like, oh, this looks good, let's try this. And that's a really great way to start too, because then you're just trying a bunch of different things and you're just having fun with it. So that's one way to start. Another way to start is research what you're wanting to do with that vegetable after you pick it. So are you wanting to freeze it, can it, cook with it? What do you want to make specifically with it? Are you wanting to make sauces with it? Are you wanting to make soup with it? Are you wanting to make stews with it? Are you wanting to make desserts or fillings or things like that? So research what you want to do with it, and that'll help you pick a good variety also. And then of course, the best way to make gardening fun is to grow what you like to eat. Do you like to eat peas? Do you like to eat cucumbers? Do you like to eat carrots, radishes, lettuce, kale? Grow something that you enjoy eating, and that will make it so much more rewarding when you finally get to that harvest time. So I hope that you guys found this video helpful and it makes your seed starting season a ton of fun and helps you get started in your garden this year. If you guys have any questions about seed starting, go ahead and leave them in the comments below and I will be happy to answer them for you. If you like my content, make sure you hit the like button on your way out. Hit the subscribe button also, that way you know when new videos are uploaded. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to grow where you're planted.